The rain hit me like a punishment the moment I pushed through the hospital doors, cold and relentless, soaking through my scrubs before I even reached the bus stop. My feet ached. My back screamed. 16 hours of back-to-back shifts had hollowed me out until I was nothing but exhaustion wrapped in damp fabric, and now I stood under the flickering shelter light, watching the empty street where my bus should have been 10 minutes ago. The schedule in my trembling hand told me I had missed it. The next one would not come for another hour. I could not wait an hour, not here, not in this neighborhood where the shadows between streetlights seemed to breathe and watch. I pulled my thin jacket tighter, though it did nothing against the storm. Calculating whether I had enough energy to walk the 2 miles home through streets, I knew better than to trust after dark. My phone showed 11:47 p.m. The battery icon glowed red at 8%. I should call someone, but Rebecca had her own problems, and I refused to spend money I did not have on a rideshare when I needed every dollar for rent that was already 5 days late. The street stretched before me, slick and dark, punctuated by the distant sound of something glass shattering. I took a breath, started walking, made it maybe 20 steps before the headlights caught me, bright and blinding, attached to a car that moved like liquid shadow, black and sleek and utterly out of place in this broken part of the city. It slowed, stopped. The passenger window descended with a whisper of expensive machinery, and I found myself looking into a face I recognized but could not place, all sharp lines and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through my soaked clothes to the fear pulsing beneath. He was beautiful in a way that made my breath catch, the kind of beautiful that came with warnings. I knew him from somewhere, the hospital maybe, visiting someone in the intensive care unit last week, moving through the halls like he owned them, nurses stepping aside without knowing why. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that expected obedience. He said I should not be out here alone. He said he would drive me home. Every instinct I had spent 28 years developing told me to refuse, to run, to take my chances with the dark streets rather than the darker promise in those eyes. But the rain was so cold, the street was so empty, and something in his expression, something almost concerned beneath the command, made me hesitate. Thunder rolled overhead. My hand reached for the door handle. I told myself it was just a ride, just a few minutes of warmth and safety, that nothing terrible would happen in the space between this corner and my apartment. I told myself I was making a practical choice. I did not let myself acknowledge the flutter low in my stomach when his gaze held mine, or the way my pulse quickened with something that was not entirely fear. I opened the door. I got in. The leather seat beneath me was warm and soft as sin, and as he pulled away from the curb, I realized I had just made either the best or worst decision of my life. The interior of the car smelled like leather and something darker, something expensive that I could not name, cedar maybe or smoke, and the warmth wrapped around me like a trap I wanted to sink into despite every warning screaming in my head. He drove with one hand on the wheel, controlled and precise, his other arm resting against the door in a posture of absolute certainty, and I found myself studying his profile when I should have been watching the road, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw, the way shadows collected beneath his cheekbones, the faint scar that traced from his temple into his hairline. He broke the silence first, his voice cutting through the rain drumming against the windows, telling me I looked exhausted, asking how long my shift had been, and I answered because the alternative was drowning in the tension thickening between us. 16 hours, I said. Double shift because someone called in sick. He nodded as though he understood bone-deep fatigue, though everything about him radiated coiled energy, power barely restrained. Then he said my name. Eleanor. He said it like he had known it forever, let it roll off his tongue with a familiarity that made my stomach clench, and I turned to stare at him fully, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. I never told you my name, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. He glanced at me, just briefly, his dark eyes unreadable. Your ID badge, he replied. I saw it last week at the hospital. But that felt like a lie, or at least not the whole truth, because he said my name like he had learned it deliberately, like he had thought about it since. I should have demanded he let me out right then, should have trusted the ice sliding down my spine, but instead, I sat frozen, watching the city blur past, aware of how small I was in this space he commanded, how utterly at his mercy. He asked where I lived, and I hesitated long enough that he noticed, his mouth curving slightly, not quite a smile. I am not going to hurt you, Eleanor, he said, and the way he spoke my name again felt like a touch. I gave him my address, the words tasting like surrender. When I told him he could drop me at the next corner, that I could walk the rest, he dismissed it with a slight shake of his head, telling me he would take me all the way home, that it was not a question. The command in his tone should have angered me, but instead it sparked something low and dangerous in my belly, something I refused to examine. We fell into silence again, and I became hyper-aware of everything. The way his fingers rested against the steering wheel, long and elegant and strong, the way he breathed, steady and calm while mine came shallow and quick, the way the space between us seemed to hum with electricity I did not understand. I knew danger when I saw it. I had spent years in emergency rooms watching what violence did to bodies. This man was dangerous. I felt it in every instinct I possessed. But danger apparently wore a beautiful face and drove a car that cost more than I would earn in 5 years. And when he looked at me again at a stoplight, really looked, I felt seen in a way that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. He pulled up in front of my building, the contrast between his sleek car and the cracked concrete almost obscene, graffiti-tagged walls and broken mailboxes illuminated by his headlights. And I felt shame crawl up my throat even as I told myself I had nothing to apologize for, that poverty was not a sin even if it felt like one in this moment. I reached for the door handle, but his voice stopped me, low and certain, telling me to wait. He retrieved something from inside his jacket and I tensed, some primal part of me suddenly convinced he was reaching for a weapon, but instead, he produced a small black card, matte and understated, holding it out to me between two fingers. "Call if you need anything," he said, and the offer hung between us, weighted with implications I could not begin to unpack. I took the card because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting, my fingers brushing his for just a second, the contact sending electricity straight through my exhausted body. His number was printed in silver, no name, no title, just digits that felt like a secret. I whispered thank you, and this time he let me go, watching as I hurried through the rain to my building entrance. And I felt his gaze on me like a physical touch until I disappeared inside. My apartment greeted me with its familiar shabbiness, the radiator clanking, the ceiling stains spreading slowly from the unit above, and I stood dripping on the worn linoleum, trying to understand what had just happened. I peeled off my wet scrubs and turned the card over in my hands, studying it like it might reveal answers. Then I did what any rational person would do in the digital age. I searched for him. My laptop took forever to boot up, the ancient machine groaning, and I typed variations of his appearance, his car, the hospital visit, until finally I found a society page photograph from 3 years ago, a charity gala, and there he was in a tailored suit standing among people who looked like they controlled the world. Alexander Thornhill. I clicked deeper, following threads, finding his name mentioned in business articles about real estate acquisitions and private investments. But then the search results turned darker, forum posts and blog speculation, carefully worded news pieces about alleged organized crime connections, federal investigations that went nowhere, witnesses who recanted, a world of power that operated just beneath the surface of legality. My hands started shaking again, but this time not from cold. I had gotten into a car with a man connected to the Mafia, a man dangerous enough that journalists only wrote about him in hypotheticals and maybes, and he knew my name, knew where I lived, had given me his private number like we were something more than strangers thrown together by rain and circumstance. I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But beneath the fear ran something else, something I refused to name. The memory of his voice saying he would not hurt me, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at me, the careful control he had maintained even when commanding. I climbed into bed as dawn started breaking, the card on my nightstand catching the gray light, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was not over, that whatever had begun tonight in his car would continue, that I had been marked somehow by his attention, and my life would never return to the simple struggle it had been just hours before. 3 days passed, and Alexander Thornhill occupied my thoughts like an infection I could not shake, his voice echoing through my mind during medication rounds, his dark eyes appearing behind my eyelids when I blinked, the memory of his controlled power making my hands unsteady as I inserted IVs and checked vitals. I told myself it was fear, residual anxiety from discovering I had accepted help from a criminal, but my racing pulse when I remembered the way he said my name suggested something far more dangerous than simple terror. Work became my refuge and my torment simultaneously, the familiar rhythms of the emergency department grounding me, even as I found myself scanning every face that came through the doors, half expecting him to appear, half hoping he would. On the third day, Rebecca cornered me during our lunch break in the staff room, her expression serious as she slid into the chair across from me, asking if I knew who Marcus Pembroke really was, the patient I had treated 2 weeks ago for a stab wound to the abdomen. I remembered Marcus, remembered his expensive watch, and the way 3 men in dark suits had stood guard outside his room, remembered how he had thanked me with unusual intensity before he was discharged. Rebecca leaned closer, her voice dropping low, telling me Marcus worked for Alexander Thornhill, that everyone knew Thornhill ran half the organized crime in the city, that the men in suits had been his protection detail. My coffee turned to acid in my stomach. She warned me to stay away from people like that, told me about a nurse at another hospital who got involved with that world and disappeared, her concern genuine and frightening. I promised her I would be careful, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue because careful had died the moment I got into that car. I left the hospital as the sun set, exhaustion pulling at my bones after another long shift, and I checked my mailbox out of habit before climbing the stairs to my apartment, expecting the usual collection of overdue bills and grocery store circulars. Instead, I found a manila envelope, thick and unmarked, wedged between advertisements for pizza delivery. My hands shook as I opened it in the dim hallway light. Cash. $100 bills, more money than I made in a month, maybe 2 months, stacked neatly and held with a single paper clip. A small card rested on top, heavy stock, expensive, with just a few words written in elegant script that somehow I knew was his handwriting. Thank you for saving Marcus. You have a gift. No signature, no name. Nothing that could tie it to him directly, but I knew with absolute certainty who had left this. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, torn between gratitude for money that could pay my overdue rent and student loans and horror at what accepting it would mean. This was not a gift. This was a claim. This was him inserting himself into my life, creating obligation and connection, binding me to him through generosity I could not afford to refuse, but was terrified to accept. I looked at his card still tucked in my wallet where I had kept it despite knowing I should throw it away, the silver numbers gleaming like a dare, and I understood with perfect clarity that he was waiting for me to call, that this envelope was designed to force exactly that response, and that whatever came next would change everything. I spent the night staring at the money spread across my kitchen table, counting it obsessively, the bills crisp and unmarked, and by morning I knew I could not keep it, could not let this debt exist between us, could not allow him to think I was someone who could be bought or claimed through generosity, no matter how desperately I needed what he offered. I called the number on his card at 8 in the morning, my finger hovering over the digits for 10 minutes before I found the courage, and he answered on the second ring, his voice alert and immediate, saying my name like a question and a statement simultaneously. "I need to return this," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt, and there was a pause that stretched long enough for me to wonder if he would refuse. But then he suggested a cafe on the north side, neutral territory, someplace public where I might feel safe, and I agreed before I could reconsider. The cafe was nothing like I expected. Not ostentatious, but quietly expensive. The kind of place where a cup of coffee cost more than my hourly wage, all exposed brick and vintage lighting, and he was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall, positioned so he could see every entrance and exit. He stood when he saw me, that same controlled grace I remembered from the car, and gestured for me to sit, his eyes tracking my movements like I was something precious and breakable. I placed the envelope on the table between us, pushing it toward him with trembling fingers, explaining that I could not accept it, that I had just been doing my job with Marcus, that this felt like too much. He did not touch the envelope. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made heat crawl up my neck, and told me I had saved a man's life, that my skill and quick thinking deserved compensation, that Marcus had 2 children who still had a father because of me. His words were reasonable, but beneath them ran something else, a current of possession that both frightened and thrilled me. We argued quietly, our voices never rising, but the tension crackling between us, and gradually the conversation shifted from the money to other things: how I became a nurse, why he valued loyalty above all else, the small details of lives lived in completely different worlds. He told me about growing up with nothing, about building an empire from violence and determination, about the loneliness of power that kept him separate from everyone, and I saw past the dangerous exterior to something wounded and human underneath. When he mentioned his sister, his voice changed, softened with old grief, and he said I reminded him of her, the same stubborn kindness, the same refusal to look away from suffering. Without thinking, I reached across the table and touched his hand, just my fingers on his knuckles, and he went completely still, his dark eyes locked on mine with an expression I could not decipher. The moment stretched between us, the cafe noise fading to nothing, and I felt myself softening despite every logical reason to maintain distance. Felt my resistance crumbling under the weight of his attention and the vulnerability he was showing me. When I finally pulled my hand back, he pushed the envelope toward me again, his voice quiet and final, telling me it was mine, that he would not take it back, that I should consider it payment for a debt he owed not just for Marcus, but for the ride home, for letting him feel human for an hour. I knew I should refuse again, should walk away from whatever this was becoming, but instead I took the envelope and tucked it in my bag, accepting more than just money, accepting a connection that terrified me even as I craved it. I left the cafe more confused than when I arrived, the weight of the money in my bag feeling heavier than it should, carrying significance I was not ready to examine, and I walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions Alexander had created inside me with his wounded eyes and careful revelations. The evening shift had drained me, but sleep felt impossible, my mind replaying every word we had exchanged. Every moment his gaze had held mine, the electric shock of touching his hand still tingling in my fingertips hours later. I took the bus home as darkness settled over the city, streetlights flickering to life as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, fumbling for my keys while balancing my bag and the jacket I had carried all day. Something felt wrong. The hallway was too quiet, the air thick with a tension I could not name, and when I glanced behind me I saw him, a man in a dark jacket standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching me with an intensity that froze my blood. He started climbing toward me, his steps deliberate and unhurried, and panic exploded through my chest. My hands shaking so hard I dropped my keys, the metallic clatter echoing in the stairwell like a gunshot. I grabbed them and ran, shoving my key into the lock. But he was faster than I expected, his footsteps pounding closer, and I knew with terrible certainty I would not make it inside before he reached me. I slammed through my door and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and through the peephole I watched him stop outside, standing there, just waiting, his face obscured by shadow, but his presence a threat I could feel through the wood. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to call, Alexander's number appearing on my screen like destiny. And when he answered, I could barely speak, terror strangling my voice as I whispered that someone was outside my door, that I was scared, that I did not know what to do. His voice changed instantly, all warmth vanishing, replaced by cold command as he told me to stay inside, to push furniture against the door, that he was coming. And I heard him shouting orders to someone in the background before the line went dead. I dragged my couch toward the door, my muscles screaming, adrenaline making me stronger than I should be, and I waited in the dark with my heart trying to break through my ribs, listening to the man outside breathing, knowing he was still there. 7 minutes passed, each second an eternity, and then I heard new footsteps, multiple sets, and Alexander's voice sharp with authority demanding the man identify himself. Through the door I heard a scuffle, a grunt of pain, and then silence before Alexander knocked, saying my name, telling me it was safe. I moved the couch and opened the door to find him standing there with another man, tall and broad-shouldered, holding the man in the dark jacket by the collar. And Alexander's face was terrifying in its cold fury as he looked me over, checking for injuries, his hands hovering near my shoulders, but not touching, not yet. The man they held was young, maybe 25, with a serpent tattoo visible on his neck, and Alexander asked him one question, "Who sent you?" His voice so quiet and deadly that even I felt afraid. "Thomas Sinclair," the man gasped, and Alexander's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin as he exchanged a glance with the other man who I suddenly understood must be James Crawford, his second in command. Alexander turned to me then, his dark eyes filled with something that looked like guilt and rage combined, and he said words that changed everything. "You are in danger now because of me. Sinclair noticed my interest in you, and he will use you to get to me. I am sorry, Eleanor, but your life just became much more complicated. You cannot stay here," Alexander said, his voice absolute and commanding, and I felt rage flood through me to replace the fear, hot and clarifying, as I stepped back from him and crossed my arms over my chest. Telling him he could not just waltz into my life and start making decisions for me like I was a child or a possession. His jaw tightened, that dangerous edge sharpening in his dark eyes as he moved closer, his presence filling my small apartment until I could barely breathe, and he said very quietly that Thomas Sinclair was not a man who made empty threats, that staying here was suicide, that I needed to let him protect me. "I will not be controlled," I told him, my voice shaking with anger and residual terror, and we stood there almost nose to nose, the air between us crackling with tension and something else, something electric and fierce that made my skin feel too tight. James cleared his throat from the doorway where he still held Sinclair's man, suggesting they needed to move, that more might be coming, and Alexander never broke eye contact with me as he told James to take the trash out and wait in the car. We were alone then, the silence thick and charged, and I could see him fighting for control, his hands flexing at his sides like he wanted to shake sense into me or pull me against him. I could not tell which. "Eleanor," he said, my name rough in his throat, "you do not understand what men like Sinclair do to send messages, what he will do to you to hurt me. Please let me keep you safe." I wanted to keep fighting, to maintain my independence and control over my own life, but something in his voice cracked my resolve, a desperate edge that spoke of experience and loss. "Show me," I said, and he hesitated before pulling out his phone, swiping through images that made my stomach turn, crime scene photos of what I assumed were Sinclair's previous messages, bodies broken in ways that spoke of deliberate cruelty and theatrical violence. My hands started trembling again as I looked at a woman maybe my age, and Alexander put the phone away, his voice gentle now, as he asked if I understood why I could not stay. I nodded, unable to speak past the horror closing my throat, and he told me to pack a bag, just enough for a few days, that he had a safe house where Sinclair could never reach me. I moved mechanically to my bedroom, pulling out the duffel bag I used for occasional overnight shifts, throwing in clothes without really seeing them, toiletries and my phone charger, and the paperback novel on my nightstand. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. This ordinary woman whose biggest worry yesterday was paying rent now packing to hide from a crime boss who wanted to use her as a weapon. Alexander appeared in my doorway, his large frame filling the space, and asked quietly if I was all right, the question so absurd given the circumstances that I almost laughed, except I was afraid if I started, I would not stop. I am terrified, I admitted, zipping the bag with shaking hands, and when I turned to face him, I saw guilt written across his features, stark and painful. "This is my fault," he said. "I brought this danger to your door, and I should have stayed away from you." "But you did not," I replied. "And now we deal with what is, not what should have been." He moved closer, reaching out to take my bag, his fingers brushing mine in a contact that sent heat through my fear. And I followed him out of my apartment, wondering if I would ever return, knowing that whatever life I had built here was over the moment I accepted his protection, realizing as I locked my door that everything had changed irrevocably, and there was no path back to the woman I had been before a missed bus brought Alexander Thornhill into my world. The safe house was a penthouse on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the city, all clean lines and expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and I stood in the center of the vast living room feeling utterly out of place, my worn duffel bag clutched in both hands like a lifeline to my real life far below. James had disappeared into one of the other rooms after a brief tour that had shown me 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with appliances I did not know how to operate, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made me feel exposed, despite Alexander's assurance that the glass was bulletproof and one-way, invisible to the outside world. "I am staying in the guest suite down the hall," James had said, his tone professional and distant. "Call if you need anything." And then I was alone in this pristine cage, this beautiful prison that smelled of leather and expensive cologne and nothing like home. I unpacked mechanically, hanging my 4 work scrubs in a closet large enough to hold 50 times my entire wardrobe, placing my drugstore shampoo in a bathroom fitted with marble and gold fixtures. The contrast between my modest belongings and this wealth making me feel like an imposter, a fraud playing at a life I had no right to inhabit. Hours crawled past, and I tried to read but could not focus. Tried to watch television, but nothing held my attention. My mind circling back constantly to the images Alexander had shown me. The reality of what Thomas Sinclair might do if he found me. The knowledge that I was trapped here indefinitely with no idea when or if my normal life would resume. The sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple fire beyond the windows, the city lights beginning to sparkle like earthbound stars, and I was staring at them numbly when I heard the elevator chime, footsteps crossing toward me. And Alexander appeared in the doorway, still wearing the dark suit from earlier, his tie loosened and his face showing exhaustion that mirrored my own. "I brought dinner," he said, gesturing to the bags James was carrying behind him. "I thought you might not feel like cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen." And the simple consideration of that gesture cracked something inside my chest, making my eyes sting with unexpected tears I refused to shed. We ate at the massive dining table that could have seated 12, just the 2 of us at one end, and the food was incredible, Thai from a restaurant I recognized from online reviews I could never afford, but I tasted nothing, my appetite buried under anxiety and displacement. "You are angry with me," Alexander said quietly, and I looked up to find him watching me with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much, to strip away all my defenses and read the truth written on my bones. I am angry at the situation, I replied, at Sinclair for making me a target, at myself for being weak enough to need protection, but not at you, not exactly, even though part of me wants to blame you because blame needs somewhere to land and you are here. He nodded slowly, setting down his fork, and asked if I wanted him to leave, to let James handle security alone, his voice carefully neutral, but something vulnerable flickering across his features. Stay, I said before I could reconsider. Please, I do not want to be alone with my thoughts right now. And he relaxed slightly, some tension easing from his shoulders as we continued eating in a silence that gradually shifted from uncomfortable to almost companionable. 3 days passed in the penthouse, and I felt the walls closing in despite the expansive space, my restlessness growing with each hour that stretched empty and purposeless, my entire identity as a nurse and helper stripped away, leaving me floating in this gilded cage with nothing to do but think and worry and wait. Alexander came every evening like clockwork, appearing at 7 with food or books, or simply his presence, and I found myself watching the clock as the hour approached, my heart quickening when I heard the elevator, anticipating our conversations that had become the only anchors in my drifting days. He brought me a collection of mystery novels on the second night, remembering I had mentioned loving Agatha Christie as a teenager, and on the third he arrived with Chinese food and questions about my childhood, listening with an intensity that made me feel like every word mattered, like I was the most fascinating person he had ever encountered. I told him about growing up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs, about putting myself through nursing school with loans I was still paying off, about the satisfaction of helping people even when the system felt broken and overwhelming. And he absorbed it all, asking follow-up questions that showed he was truly hearing me, not just passing time. On the fourth evening, he came earlier than usual and found me pacing the living room like a caged animal, my frustration visible in every tense line of my body, and he suggested teaching me basic self-defense so I would feel less helpless, less like a victim waiting for violence to find her. We moved furniture to clear space on the hardwood floor, and he showed me how to stand, how to balance my weight, how to strike vulnerable points with maximum efficiency, his hands positioning my shoulders and hips with a clinical professionalism that slowly dissolved as we continued. He stood behind me demonstrating holds, his body pressed against mine, his voice low in my ear explaining leverage and momentum, and I felt heat building between us, awareness crackling like static electricity charging the air. When he moved in front of me to show defensive positions, we were suddenly close enough that I could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes, could smell his cologne mixing with clean sweat, could feel his breath warm on my face as he guided my hands to his chest and throat, showing me where to push if someone grabbed me. Time seemed to stop and we stood frozen, his hands still holding my wrists, our faces inches apart, and I saw desire flash hot and fierce in his expression before he caught himself and stepped back, releasing me abruptly. "I cannot," he said, his voice rough and strained. "I cannot offer you a normal life, Eleanor. Everything about me is danger and darkness, and you deserve better. You deserve safety and stability, and a man who comes home at predictable hours to a quiet existence." The words felt like rejection even though I could see the want still burning in his eyes, could see how much it cost him to pull away, and I stood there breathing hard from more than exertion, my body still humming from his proximity, my mind racing with responses I was not yet brave enough to voice. He left early that night with an excuse about business that needed attention, and I lay awake in the enormous bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of contact, every look, every word, knowing that something between us had shifted irrevocably, that the attraction we had been dancing around could not be ignored much longer, that despite every logical reason to maintain distance, I wanted him with an intensity that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I could not sleep after Alexander left, my body still electric from his touch, my mind replaying the feel of his hands positioning me, the heat of his chest under my palms, the naked want in his eyes before he retreated behind walls of nobility and self-sacrifice. I lay there until midnight, then 1, then 2, frustration building into something sharp and urgent until I finally threw off the covers and stalked into the living room, my bare feet silent on the cool floor, my heart pounding with reckless determination. I knew he had not left the building. James had mentioned Alexander kept a suite on the 40th floor for nights when business ran late, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was in the elevator pressing the button, descending 2 floors in my sleep shorts and tank top, my pulse hammering in my throat. The hallway was silent and dimly lit, only one door visible, and I knocked before courage could desert me, 3 sharp raps that sounded thunderous in the quiet. The door opened within seconds and Alexander stood there in dress pants and an unbuttoned shirt, his hair disheveled like he had been running his hands through it, surprise and concern flashing across his features when he saw me. "Eleanor, what is wrong?" he asked, already reaching for me, already scanning the hall for threats, and I stepped into his space, close enough to feel his heat, close enough to see his pupils dilate. "I never asked for normal," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You keep deciding what I deserve, what I can handle, but you never ask what I want, and I am telling you now that I want this. I want you, dangerous life and dark world and all of it, so stop protecting me from yourself." His jaw clenched, conflict warring in his expression, and he said my name like a prayer or a curse. "Eleanor, you do not understand what you are saying. Once you step into my world, there is no going back. You will always be a target, always be in danger. And I cannot bear the thought of you hurt because of me." "Then teach me to protect myself," I replied. "Let me choose this with open eyes instead of making the choice for me." And before he could argue further, I closed the distance between us and kissed him, pressing my mouth to his with all the pent-up longing of these strange suspended days. For one frozen heartbeat he remained still, and then something broke inside him. Some last restraint shattered, and he was kissing me back with fierce hunger, his hands coming up to cup my face, his body pressing me backward into his suite as he kicked the door shut behind us. The kiss was everything the almost kiss had promised, urgent and desperate and real, his tongue sliding against mine, his teeth catching my lower lip, his hands moving from my face to my hair to my waist, pulling me against him like he wanted to eliminate every atom of space between us. We broke apart gasping, and he rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling slightly where they gripped my hips. "I have tried to stay away," he said, his voice raw and low. "I have tried to do the right thing. But Eleanor, I cannot. I cannot stop thinking about you, cannot stop wanting you. You have gotten under my skin and into my blood, and I am lost." "I feel safer with you than I ever have before," I whispered back, "which makes no sense because you are the most dangerous person I know. But it is true. With you, I feel seen and protected and alive in ways I never knew I was numb. So please stop pushing me away." We spent the rest of the night on his couch tangled together, kissing and talking and kissing again. His hands learning the shape of me, my fingers tracing the scars on his knuckles, our words spilling out in the darkness, confessions and fears and hopes woven between touches that promised more but did not rush, both of us knowing that this moment mattered, that we were building something that needed this foundation of honesty and connection before bodies joined in the way our hearts already had. Morning light filtered through the windows of Alexander's suite, where I had fallen asleep against his chest, our legs tangled together on the couch, and I woke to the sound of sharp knocking that shattered the peaceful bubble we had created in the darkness. Alexander was instantly alert, his body tensing beneath me, his hand moving to my shoulder in a protective gesture as he called for whoever it was to enter. And James appeared looking grim and urgent, his eyes flickering to me with something like apology before he spoke. "Sinclair escalated overnight," James said without preamble. "He sent men to the hospital asking questions about Eleanor, threatened staff, left a message with the night supervisor that he knows where she works and will be waiting, and Alexander's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The tender man who had held me through the night vanishing behind a mask of cold calculation and controlled fury. He stood, gently disentangling himself from me, and began pacing while James rattled off details about numbers and locations and threat assessments, their conversation full of terminology I barely understood, and I sat there feeling invisible and helpless. Watching Alexander transform into someone I recognized from rumors and news reports, the dangerous man whose world I had claimed I wanted to enter. They talked about safe houses and relocation and increased security like I was a package to be stored rather than a person, and something hot and sharp rose in my chest, frustration mixing with fear, mixing with determination, until I could not stay silent any longer. "I am not hiding," I said, my voice cutting through their tactical discussion, both men turning to look at me with surprise, and I stood to face them, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like armor. "Eleanor," Alexander started, his tone already dismissive in that protective way that made me want to scream, but I cut him off. "You keep making decisions about my life without including me," I said, "treating me like I am fragile or stupid or incapable, but I am the one Sinclair is targeting. I am the one whose life is at risk, and I deserve to be part of the solution instead of just the problem you need to solve." Alexander's jaw clenched, and I saw him struggling between the instinct to protect and something else. Maybe respect, maybe recognition. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his voice tight, and I took a breath, steadying myself. "Use me as bait," I said. "Let me go back to work. Let Sinclair's people approach me, and we control the situation. We set the trap instead of waiting for him to spring one." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, and Alexander stared at me like I had suggested something obscene, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice hard and final. "I will not put you in direct danger. I will not use you as bait like you are expendable." "I am already in danger," I shot back. "Hiding does not change that. It just takes away my agency, my choice, and I thought you understood that I need to be part of this, that I am choosing your world, which means choosing to fight instead of cower." We argued back and forth, voices rising, James standing awkwardly by the door watching his boss face someone who refused to be managed or controlled. And I saw the moment Alexander's resistance began to crack. Saw him recognize my courage even as it terrified him. Finally, he closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, defeat and admiration mingling in his expression when he looked at me again. "If we do this," he said carefully, "we do it my way, with my people watching every moment. And at the first sign of real danger, you follow orders without question." And I nodded, victory and fear tangling in my stomach as I realized what I had just committed to, what stepping into Alexander's world as a partner, rather than someone protected, truly meant. The wire felt cold against my skin beneath my scrubs, a constant reminder of the danger I had volunteered for as I walked through the hospital doors at 7 that morning, my hands steady through sheer force of will, my eyes scanning faces in the lobby and wondering which belonged to Sinclair's people. Alexander had spent 2 hours the previous evening coaching me, his voice calm and methodical as he explained how to respond, what to say, how to appear frightened enough to be believable but not so terrified I would seem useless. And James had fitted the wire with professional efficiency, testing it 3 times, while Alexander watched with an expression that told me he hated every second of this plan, despite agreeing to it. I made it through morning rounds on autopilot, checking vitals and administering medications while my awareness stayed fractured between my patients and every person who passed in the hallway. And Rebecca noticed immediately that something was wrong, pulling me aside near the nurse's station to ask if I was okay, her eyes full of concern that made guilt twist in my stomach because I could not tell her the truth. "I am just tired," I lied, double shifts catching up with me, and she accepted it with a skeptical look that said she knew I was holding back, but would not push. They came at noon during my lunch break, when the cafeteria was crowded and loud. Two men in casual clothes who sat down at my table without invitation, their faces unremarkable except for the cold calculation in their eyes, and the one on my right said Eleanor Ashford, in a voice that was not a question. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral, confused, and said yes, can I help you? And the man on my left leaned closer, his breath smelling of coffee and threat. You can help yourself, he said quietly. By being smart and cooperative, we know you have been spending time with Alexander Thornhill, and our employer Thomas Sinclair would very much like to know details about Thornhill's operations, his properties, his schedules, anything you have learned while warming his bed. The crudeness was meant to intimidate, and it worked, heat flooding my face, but I channeled it into the performance. Letting my voice shake as I said, I do not know what you are talking about. I barely know Alexander. The man on my right smiled without warmth and slid a phone across the table showing a photo of me leaving Alexander's building 2 nights ago, evidence that demolished my denial. You will find out what we need to know, he said, or there will be consequences. For you, for your job, for your pretty face, and you will meet us tomorrow night at 9 at the construction site on Archer Street to deliver information. Do you understand? I nodded, trying to look terrified, which was not difficult because beneath the adrenaline and focus, I was genuinely afraid, and whispered, I understand. I will find out what I can. Please do not hurt me. They left as suddenly as they arrived, and I sat there with my untouched sandwich, my pulse hammering. Knowing Alexander had heard everything through the wire, knowing the trap was set, and feeling the weight of what I had just set in motion settle over me like a storm about to break. The construction site on Archer Street loomed skeletal and menacing in the darkness, half-built structures casting jagged shadows under flickering work lights that someone had left running, and I stood near the entrance holding a folder of false information that Alexander had carefully prepared, my breath visible in the cold air, my body tense with awareness that his men were positioned throughout the site, though I could not see them. The two men from the hospital appeared at exactly 9, emerging from a dark sedan with confident strides that told me they believed they controlled this situation, and the one who had sat on my right gestured for me to approach, his voice carrying across the empty space as he said, You are smarter than you look, bringing us what we need. I walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from my body, fear metallic on my tongue, and handed over the folder, watching him flip through pages, detailing shipment schedules and property locations. All of it fabricated, but believable enough to pass initial scrutiny. He nodded with satisfaction, and I felt a flicker of relief that maybe this would end simply, that I could walk away and let Alexander's people follow them back to Sinclair. But then headlights blazed from 3 directions, and vehicles poured into the construction site, far more than Alexander had anticipated, and the man's expression shifted to something ugly and knowing as he grabbed my arm with bruising force. Did you think we were stupid? He hissed, his breath hot against my face. Sinclair knew Thornhill would set a trap, so he set a better one, and suddenly there were men everywhere, gunfire cracking through the night as Alexander's hidden team engaged with Sinclair's forces, and I was being dragged backward toward a black van, my feet scrambling for purchase, my voice lost in the chaos. I saw James emerge from behind a concrete barrier firing with lethal precision, saw men falling and shouting and the world narrowing to violence and terror. And then the man holding me shoved me toward the van, where another waited with the door open, hands reaching for me. I twisted and fought, my self-defense training surfacing through panic, and managed to slam my elbow into someone's face, feeling cartilage crunch, but there were too many, and I was being lifted, carried, my scream finally breaking free. Then Alexander was there, moving through the violence like something elemental and unstoppable, his face a mask of fury I had never witnessed, and he struck the man holding me with such force I heard bone break, catching me as I stumbled. He positioned himself between me and every threat, his body a shield, his gun firing with cold efficiency, and I pressed against his back, watching him become the dangerous man whose reputation had preceded him. The killer, the force, and I felt awe tangled with fear, understanding fully what he was capable of when protecting what belonged to him. The fight lasted minutes but felt endless, and when the last of Sinclair's men either fled or fell, Alexander turned to me, his hands framing my face, his eyes wild and searching, and I saw beneath the violence to the terror he had felt at nearly losing me, the absolute ruthlessness born from something deeper than strategy. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice shaking despite his steady hands, and I shook my head, unable to speak, understanding that I had just seen the complete truth of Alexander Thornhill and still felt safe in his arms. Alexander pulled me toward his car with urgent hands, while James and the remaining men secured the scene, checking bodies and calling for cleanup crews, the efficiency of it chilling in its practiced precision, and I stumbled beside him still shaking from adrenaline, my mind replaying the moment I had been dragged toward that van, the certainty I would disappear into darkness. He opened the passenger door and guided me inside with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence I had just witnessed, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed my shoulder, and when he slid into the driver's seat, he did not start the engine immediately, but sat there gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, his breathing harsh and uneven in the silence. "Eleanor," he said, and my name sounded like a prayer or a curse. "I cannot. If they had taken you." And his voice broke on the words, the control he wore like armor fracturing, and I reached for him without thinking, my hand covering his, feeling the tension vibrating through his entire body. He turned to me, and I saw raw fear in his eyes, the kind that came from facing a loss too devastating to survive. And he pulled me across the console into his arms with desperate strength, burying his face against my neck, his breath hot and ragged against my skin. I held him while he shook, this powerful, dangerous man coming apart in the aftermath of nearly losing what he could not afford to lose, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was not just important to him, but essential, woven into something fundamental in his carefully controlled existence. "I cannot lose you," he said against my throat, his voice muffled and raw. "I have built empires and destroyed enemies and controlled every variable but you, Eleanor. You are the one thing I cannot strategize or protect adequately, and it terrifies me, what I feel, how vulnerable you make me." I pulled back enough to frame his face with my hands, seeing blood spatter on his collar and the lethal coldness not yet fully faded from his eyes, and I kissed him with all the fear and relief and desperate need coursing through me, tasting danger and devotion, and he responded with matching intensity, his hands tangling in my hair, anchoring me to him. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and he pressed his forehead to mine, his eyes closed, and whispered, "I am taking you home. My home. Not the safe house. I need you where I can see you and touch you and know you are real." I nodded because I needed the same thing, needed to be in his private space, his real life, and he started the engine and drove through the city streets with one hand on the wheel and the other holding mine with unbreakable grip. And I watched the buildings pass and felt everything shifting, the danger bringing us to a place of absolute honesty where pretense and distance could not survive. And when we pulled through the gates of his estate, I knew I was crossing a threshold that would change everything between us, entering not just his home, but the guarded heart he protected more fiercely than any territory. Alexander's home revealed itself in layers as we moved through rooms that spoke of wealth applied with restraint, the foyer opening into a living space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, leather and dark wood and subtle lighting, creating atmosphere that felt both masculine and unexpectedly intimate. And on the mantel above a fireplace I saw them, photographs in simple frames showing a young girl with dark eyes and Alexander's same serious expression, his sister, the ghost who had shaped him. He watched me looking at the photos and said her name was Sophia, She was 12 when she died, caught in violence meant for our father, and I have spent every day since then building something she would not recognize, but that keeps others like her safe in ways I could not protect her. And I heard the guilt beneath his words, the young Jew wound that explained his control and his codes, and I turned to him and said she would see what you have become and understand you did the best you could with unbearable loss. Something in his face cracked open, and he reached for me with hands that trembled slightly, pulling me against him. And I felt the last of his careful distance dissolve as he kissed me with desperate reverence, walking me backward through his home to a bedroom that smelled of him, cedar and something darker. And we undressed each other with urgent tenderness, my fingers tracing scars on his chest that told stories of violence survived, his hands mapping my body like he was memorizing every detail against future loss. When he moved inside me, it felt like more than physical joining, like we were sealing something forged through fear and trust, and choices made in full knowledge of consequences. And afterward, we lay tangled together, my head on his chest listening to his heartbeat slow, and he told me everything, his voice quiet in the darkness, about how his father had built the organization and died violently, how Alexander had taken control at 23 and restructured it with codes that minimized civilian harm, how he walked a line between criminal and protector that left him isolated from normal human connection. He told me about territories and alliances, about the money he moved and the politicians he owned, about violence he had ordered and deaths he carried, and I listened without flinching because I had chosen to see all of him, the dangerous and the devoted. And when he finished, he searched my face with vulnerable intensity, waiting for judgment or rejection. I traced the line of his jaw and said, I am not naive about what you do or who you are. I have seen you kill to protect me. I have felt the danger that surrounds you, and I am choosing this with my eyes open because what I feel for you is stronger than fear, stronger than the safety I thought I wanted, and I would rather have this complicated, dangerous, real thing than a comfortable life with someone who does not make me feel the way you do. He closed his eyes and pulled me tighter against him, his breath shuddering, and whispered, You are either the bravest or most foolish woman I have ever known. And I smiled against his skin and said perhaps both. Perhaps that is what it takes to love someone like you. And the word love hung between us, acknowledged finally. The truth we had been circling since that rainy night when he had offered me a ride home and set us both on this irreversible path. Morning light filtered through the bedroom windows when the doorbell rang with sharp insistence, pulling me from the first peaceful sleep I had experienced in weeks, and Alexander stirred beside me, his body tensing instantly from relaxed to alert, the transformation reminding me that danger was his constant companion, even in these quiet moments. He rose and dressed quickly in tailored trousers and a shirt he did not bother buttoning fully, and I pulled on the robe he offered me, following him downstairs despite his gesture for me to stay, unwilling to be separated even for something as mundane as answering the door. James stood in the foyer looking grim, and beside him was a man in his late 40s with a detective shield clipped to his belt and cold calculation in his pale eyes, Detective William Darcy, and I felt Alexander's posture shift subtly into the controlled, dangerous version of himself he showed to threats. Darcy's gaze slid past Alexander to me with uncomfortable thoroughness, lingering on the robe and my bare feet and the obvious intimacy of the situation, and he smiled without warmth, saying, I am investigating the hospitalization of 6 men from last night's incident in the warehouse district, men associated with Thomas Sinclair, and I understand Miss Ashford may have witnessed the altercation. Alexander moved slightly, placing himself between Darcy's stare and me, his voice perfectly calm but edged with steel when he said Eleanor witnessed an attempt on her life and defended herself. Anything beyond that is my concern. And Darcy laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass, replying that a nurse involved in organized violence could face serious professional consequences. The state board takes a dim view of criminal associations. It would be unfortunate if Miss Ashford lost her license over poor judgment and companions. Ice formed in my stomach because he was right. My nursing license was everything. Years of school and debt and work to earn it, my identity and livelihood, and losing it would destroy the life I had built. And I saw Darcy watching my face, reading my fear, feeding on it. Alexander's hand found mine and squeezed once, grounding me, and he said to Darcy with dangerous quiet, "What exactly are you proposing, detective? Because it sounds remarkably like extortion." And Darcy shrugged, saying he was simply concerned about a citizen's welfare, that cooperation with his investigation might demonstrate Eleanor's unwilling involvement, that he could be persuaded to keep certain details out of his official report. I watched the exchange and understood with sickening clarity that Darcy was not here for justice. He was here as Sinclair's weapon, using the law and my vulnerability to pressure Alexander. And the threat had not ended with last night's violence, but simply evolved into something more insidious. Alexander's thumb stroked across my knuckles in subtle reassurance, while his face remained expressionless, and he told Darcy he would need time to consult with his attorney, that nothing would be discussed without proper legal representation. And Darcy smiled again and handed Alexander a card, saying he would expect contact within 24 hours, or he would proceed with filing his report, including Miss Ashford's presence at multiple crime scenes associated with known criminal enterprises. When James escorted Darcy out, I felt the walls closing in again, the brief peace shattered, and Alexander turned to me with fury and frustration warring in his eyes, pulling me against him. And I pressed my face to his chest, feeling the danger tightening around us like a noose, understanding that loving him meant endless threats from endless angles, that his world would never allow us simple happiness. Alexander spent the afternoon in his study making calls with clipped, controlled language that revealed nothing but communicated everything, negotiating something with Darcy that he would not detail to me despite my questions. And when he emerged hours later, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, the weight of compromises and calculations pressing down on him. He told me Darcy had agreed to leave me out of his official report in exchange for information about a rival operation moving drugs through the port, names and shipment schedules that would give Darcy a high-profile arrest and elevate his career. And I listened, feeling something cold settle in my chest, because this was how Alexander's world worked, trading pieces on a board where everyone was corrupt and justice was just another commodity to be bought and sold. He framed it as protection, as doing what was necessary to keep me safe, but I saw the resignation in his eyes, the compromise eating at him, and I said, "Do you trust Darcy to keep his word?" And Alexander's pause told me everything before he said, "Trust is not the relevant factor. Leverage is, and Darcy knows I can destroy him if he reneges." But I did not trust it, could not accept that my safety rested on the word of a man who sold his badge to the highest bidder. And after Alexander returned to his study to finalize details, I opened my laptop and began searching, digging through public records and news archives with the methodical focus I used for researching medical conditions, looking for the connections I knew must exist. It took hours, cross-referencing property records and court documents and archived newspaper articles. But I found them, breadcrumbs leading back years showing Darcy's name appearing in cases connected to Sinclair's operations, charges that disappeared, evidence that went missing, a pattern of corruption so deep it could not be coincidental. I found financial records through a public database showing Darcy owned property far beyond what a detective's salary could afford, a lake house and investment accounts. And I found photos from charity events showing him standing beside Sinclair looking comfortable and familiar, not enemies, but partners. When Alexander emerged near midnight, I showed him everything spread across the dining table, pages printed and highlighted, connections mapped, and I watched surprise flicker across his face before it settled into something that looked almost like pride. And he said, "You did this," running his finger along the timeline I had constructed. And I nodded, saying I spent years learning to research and verify information. Lives depend on accuracy in medicine, and these skills translate. He studied the evidence with absolute focus, his strategic mind immediately seeing what I had found, that Darcy was not just taking payment from Sinclair, but was embedded in his organization at a fundamental level, that any deal made with Darcy would be reported directly back to Sinclair, that we had been playing into their hands. Alexander looked at me with intensity that made my breath catch and said, "You may have just saved both our lives. This changes everything." And I felt a surge of fierce satisfaction because I was not just the protected, but the partner. Not just reacting to danger, but actively working to eliminate it. We spent the next hour strategizing together, Alexander's knowledge of criminal operations combining with my evidence to form a new plan, one that would not just buy temporary safety, but would expose Darcy and cut off Sinclair's access to law enforcement protection. And as we worked side by side, I felt us becoming something more than lovers seeking shelter in each other, becoming true allies facing danger as equals. And when Alexander pulled me against him and kissed me with fierce gratitude, I tasted possibility, the chance that we might actually survive this and build something lasting from the ashes of the threat that had brought us together. I requested a meeting with Catherine Langley through official channels, using my employee credentials to schedule time during her open office hours. And when I arrived at her top-floor administrative suite 2 days later, I carried a folder containing everything I had compiled on Darcy, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs because this was a risk that could end my career if Catherine was less principled than I hoped. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, a reputation for running the hospital with exacting standards and zero tolerance for anything that compromised patient care or institutional integrity. And when she gestured for me to sit across from her broad desk, I saw curiosity and wariness in equal measure. I began by saying I had information about corruption that was using our hospital for criminal purposes, and I watched her spine straighten, full attention locking on me, and I spread the documents showing Darcy's connections to Sinclair, the pattern of cases connected to our facility, the way patients associated with organized crime received special treatment or information was leaked, and Catherine studied each page with laser focus, her jaw tightening. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment before asking how I had obtained this information and what my connection to these people was, and I knew this was the moment where honesty would either save or destroy me, so I told her the truth, that I had been targeted by Sinclair because of my connection to Alexander Thornhill, that I had researched Darcy to protect myself, that I was bringing this to her because I believed she would prioritize the hospital's integrity over politics or fear. Catherine looked at me with an expression I could not read and said, "Eleanor, I have watched you work for 3 years. You are one of the best nurses on staff, and I am deeply troubled that criminal elements have invaded my hospital and put you at risk." And relief flooded through me because her emphasis was on my safety and the hospital's compromise, not judgment of my relationship. She asked what outcome I was seeking, and I said justice, exposure of Darcy's corruption, and elimination of Sinclair's access to the hospital, and Catherine nodded slowly, saying, "If we do this, we do it properly, with federal authorities and documentation that will stand up in court. I will not have this institution's reputation destroyed by half measures." Over the next hour we planned, Catherine making calls to federal contacts she had cultivated over decades in hospital administration, explaining the situation with clinical precision, and I watched her transform from cautious listener to fierce ally, a woman who had built her career on protecting her institution and would not tolerate its exploitation. Alexander arrived at my request, entering Catherine's office with James, and I saw Catherine assess him with the same sharp evaluation she used on everyone, and Alexander met her gaze with respectful directness, saying, "Mrs. Langley, I appreciate your willingness to help Eleanor. This situation has escalated beyond what any civilian should face." Catherine surprised me by responding that she had suspected organized crime was using the hospital for years, but lacked proof. That Sinclair's operations had caused 2 overdose deaths in her emergency department last month alone, that her reasons for cooperation were not just about helping me, but about removing a cancer from her institution. We spent the afternoon coordinating a sting operation, Catherine providing access and documentation, Alexander offering strategic insight into how Sinclair and Darcy would move, and I sat between them feeling powerful and focused. No longer the victim being protected, but an active architect of our solution. And when Catherine shook my hand before we left, she said, "You are stronger than you know, Eleanor," and I felt that strength settling into my bones like truth. The sting was scheduled for a Thursday evening when Darcy typically made his collections from Sinclair's hospital operations. Catherine coordinating with federal agents who positioned themselves in unmarked vehicles throughout the parking structure and in administrative offices, disguised as late shift workers. And I went through my shift with adrenaline singing through my veins. Every movement precise and controlled, while my mind tracked the timeline Alexander had mapped out that morning. Darcy arrived at 1847, according to the text Catherine sent. Walking through the emergency entrance with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, his badge clipped to his belt like a shield against consequences, and I watched from the nurse's station as he moved toward the pharmaceutical storage area, where Sinclair's people typically left his payment, hidden among legitimate supply deliveries. Catherine had equipped the area with additional cameras, and I saw on the security monitor as Darcy retrieved an envelope from behind a shelf of IV solutions, saw him count the cash with practiced efficiency, and then federal agents emerged from their positions with weapons drawn and voices sharp with authority, announcing his arrest. Darcy's face went through shock, then calculation, then rage in rapid succession, and I felt cold satisfaction watching him realize his corruption had finally caught up to him, that all the years of selling his badge had led to this moment of public humiliation and legal destruction, and Catherine stood beside me, watching the monitor with grim vindication, saying that man has been a stain on this institution for too long. But then everything shifted because James appeared at the nurse's station, moving fast with tension radiating from him, and he said, "Eleanor, Sinclair knows. He is coming here now. Alexander is mobilizing, but you need to get to the secure room Catherine prepared." And fear spiked through me sharp and immediate because we had anticipated Darcy's arrest would draw Sinclair out, but not this quickly, not with such desperate aggression. Catherine immediately initiated lockdown protocols, her administrator training taking over as she directed staff to secure patients and clear hallways, and James gripped my arm, pulling me toward the administrative wing where a reinforced office waited. But I resisted, saying, "Where is Alexander? Is he safe?" And James said, "He is inbound with our people, but Sinclair has numbers in desperation. We need you protected before this becomes a war zone." We moved through corridors that felt too long and exposed, my nursing shoes silent on polished floors while my heart hammered against my ribs, and I heard shouting from the emergency entrance, the sound of violence and chaos erupting in a place meant for healing, and every instinct I had screamed to go help because I was a nurse and people might be hurt. But James kept me moving, saying, "Your safety is what keeps Alexander focused. If you are secure, he can handle Sinclair without distraction." We reached the office, and James positioned himself outside the reinforced door, and through the window I saw hospital security rushing toward the disturbance. Saw Catherine on her phone coordinating with police. And then I saw on the security monitor that James had pulled up on his phone the parking garage where Alexander's vehicle screeched to a stop, and he emerged with controlled lethal purpose. And I knew Sinclair was here, in my hospital, bringing his violence to the place where I saved lives, and the wrongness of it filled me with fury that burned away the fear, because this ended now, tonight, one way or another. I watched the security monitor as Alexander moved through the parking garage with lethal grace, James and 4 other men flanking him in tactical formation, and then I saw Sinclair emerge from a black van with at least 8 armed men, desperation making him reckless because he had to know this was his last move, that everything was collapsing and taking me hostage was his only leverage, and the two groups faced each other in the harsh fluorescent lighting with weapons drawn and voices carrying through the concrete structure in sharp echoing commands. Alexander stood at the center, utterly controlled despite the odds, and I saw him speaking though I could not hear the words, saw Sinclair gesturing wildly, his face twisted with rage and fear, and I knew this would end in blood, that men would die in this place of healing because of me, because I had become the pressure point in a war I never asked to join, and something inside me refused to let that happen. Refused to hide while Alexander put himself between me and violence one more time. I told James through the door that I was going out there and he said absolutely not, his voice hard with command. But I was done being protected like a helpless thing. Done watching other people fight battles that were as much mine as theirs. So I opened the reinforced door before he could stop me and moved toward the stairwell that led to the parking garage. My nursing shoes silent on concrete steps, while my heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. James caught up to me halfway down, cursing under his breath, and he said, "If you are doing this, I am with you. Alexander will kill me anyway." And we emerged together into the parking garage where every head turned toward us, weapons shifting, and I saw Alexander's face transform from controlled strategy to pure fear in the span of a heartbeat. Saw him mouth my name like a prayer or a curse. Sinclair smiled, triumphant and vicious, saying, "There she is, the little nurse who thinks she can play in our world. Come here, Eleanor." And maybe everyone walks away from this. And I felt James tense beside me, but I stepped forward saying no. "You come here and listen to what I have to say." And my voice carried through the garage with a steadiness I did not feel, adrenaline making everything sharp and bright and slow. I held up my phone and said, "Everything you have done is documented. Every connection between you and Darcy, every operation you ran through this hospital, every threat you made. It is all recorded and already sent to federal authorities and media contacts. You have no leverage, no escape, nothing to bargain with." And I watched his smile falter because he had expected fear and pleading, not this cold presentation of his defeat. Alexander moved slightly closer, positioning himself to reach me if Sinclair made a move, and he said, "Eleanor is right. This is over Thomas. Your organization is dismantled. Darcy has turned on you to save himself. Your money is frozen, and coming here was the final mistake that guarantees you die in prison instead of on the street." And I heard the truth in his voice, the absolute certainty that Sinclair's power was already gone. Sinclair's face went through calculation and realization, and then pure rage. And I saw the moment he decided that if he was finished, he would take me with him, saw him lunge forward with a weapon rising, and Alexander moved faster than should have been possible, covering the distance between us and putting his body between me and Sinclair's gun. And time stretched and contracted as James and the others swarmed Sinclair, driving him to the concrete while his weapon clattered away. And I grabbed Alexander, checking for wounds with nurse-trained hands, while he held my face, saying, "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" And I shook my head, feeling tears I had not known were falling. Police sirens wailed through the parking garage within seconds, the sound echoing off concrete walls, as uniformed officers poured in with weapons drawn. And Sinclair lay face down on the oil-stained floor, with James's knee in his back and zip ties binding his wrists, while he spat curses that meant nothing anymore because his power was gone, dismantled as thoroughly as Alexander had promised. I stood with my hands still on Alexander's chest, feeling his heartbeat hammering beneath my palms. And he held my face like I might disappear if he let go, his gray eyes searching mine for injury or trauma, while I searched his for the same, and I realized in that crystallized moment that he would have taken that bullet without hesitation, would have died right here in this fluorescent-lit garage to keep me safe, and the weight of that devotion pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The police separated Sinclair from James and hauled him upright, reading rights that blurred into background noise. And a federal agent I recognized from the sting operation approached Alexander saying, "We have everything we need. Darcy is cooperating fully, and Sinclair's entire network is exposed. You kept your end clean, and we will keep ours." And Alexander nodded with the wary respect of someone who understood that agreements with law enforcement were temporary truces rather than true alliances. Catherine appeared at the garage entrance with Rebecca beside her, both women's faces tight with concern, and Rebecca rushed to me, pulling me into a fierce hug, saying, "I saw everything on the monitors. You terrified me, Eleanor, walking out there like that." And I held her back, feeling the trembling in my own limbs now that the adrenaline was fading, the crash inevitable and approaching fast. Alexander spoke quietly with James and the others, his voice carrying command even in the aftermath of violence, and I watched him coordinate their departure and cleanup with the efficiency of someone who had managed crisis situations countless times. But when his eyes found mine again, I saw something different than his usual control, something raw and unguarded that looked like fear finally acknowledged. The police cleared the scene methodically, taking statements and securing evidence. And Catherine vouched for me and Alexander both, her position and cooperation giving us credibility that smoothed over the more complicated questions about why a nurse and a known figure from the city's gray economy had been involved in bringing down a corrupt detective and rival criminal. As Sinclair was loaded into a police vehicle, still shouting threats that sounded hollow and desperate, Alexander pulled me aside into a quieter corner of the garage, and he said, "You should not have come out here. You could have been killed, Eleanor," and his voice shook slightly on my name, the tremor revealing how thoroughly I had shattered his composure. I touched his jaw, feeling the tension there, and said, "You would have died for me. I saw it in your eyes. You were ready to take that bullet," and he did not deny it, just pressed his forehead to mine and breathed like a man surfacing from deep water. And I understood then that we had crossed some final threshold, that whatever this was between us had been forged and tested and proven in ways that normal relationships never experienced. We stood like that while the police finished and the garage slowly emptied. Two people who had found each other through danger and chosen each other despite it. And when James approached saying it was time to leave, Alexander took my hand and we walked out together into the cool night air where the hospital rose behind us, lit and humming with life. And I knew everything had changed, that we had survived the worst and now faced the complicated, beautiful work of building something real from the ashes of violence and fear. 6 weeks had passed since that night in the parking garage, 6 weeks of statements to federal investigators and quiet restructuring of Alexander's operations and gradual return to something that resembled normal life, though normal now meant something entirely different than it had before I missed that bus in the rain. I stood at the nurse's station finishing my shift notes, while Rebecca leaned against the counter drinking terrible coffee and watching me with the expression she wore when she wanted to say something, but was choosing her words carefully. And finally she said, "He is outside again, waiting for you." And I smiled because Alexander had picked me up from work every day this week, patient and constant, in the way he demonstrated his commitment to this new life we were building together. The hospital had become safer after Sinclair's arrest, and Darcy's cooperation exposed the corruption that had used these halls for criminal enterprise, and Catherine had been quietly grateful in the way administrators showed gratitude, with better shifts and tacit approval of my relationship with a man whose reputation was known but whose recent actions had helped clean her hospital. Rebecca said I was wrong about him, Eleanor. I thought he would get you killed or break your heart. But I see how he looks at you, like you are the only thing in any room that matters. And I touched her hand, grateful for her acceptance, because her friendship meant everything, and I had feared losing it when my world collided with Alexander's. I changed out of my scrubs in the locker room and pulled on jeans and the soft sweater Alexander had bought me, cashmere in deep blue that he said matched my eyes. The kind of luxury I would never have purchased for myself, but that he gave freely alongside his protection and devotion and slowly revealed tenderness. When I walked out through the main entrance, I saw him leaning against the black car that had started everything, and he straightened when he saw me with that slight smile that transformed his dangerous face into something warm, and I moved into his arms feeling safe and chosen and home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the person holding me. He kissed my forehead and said, "How was your shift?" And I told him about the child I had helped stabilize, and the elderly man who made terrible jokes, and the ordinary beautiful work of healing that remained my purpose, even as everything else had changed. We drove through the city as evening fell, and lights began to glow in windows, and Alexander's hand found mine on the seat between us, his thumb tracing circles on my wrist, in absent affection that spoke of comfort and familiarity earned through crisis and choice. He had restructured his operations like he promised, moving away from the most dangerous elements and toward legitimate business, using his strategic mind and resources for enterprises that would not put me at risk or require me to compromise my values. And I knew the transformation was not complete, but I also knew he was trying, changing the shape of his life to make space for me in it. I looked at his profile as he drove, and remembered that rainy night when I had been exhausted and frightened, and he had appeared like something from a different world offering shelter. And I thought about fate and choice, and how sometimes the most dangerous decision becomes the one that saves you. We pulled up to his home that had become our home, and he turned to me saying, "I love you, Eleanor." And I said, "I love you too." And we walked inside together, partners in every sense, two people who had found each other in the space between danger and devotion, and built something real from the ashes of violence. And I knew whatever came next, we would face it side by side.